Right now we have a panel, 4 panelists. We're going to talk about the case for change and why change is really needed from their perspective. We have Stephanie Field, Director of Pharmacy Business Services at Spectrum Health System in beautiful Grand Rapids, Michigan. We have Michael Ganio, Director of Pharmacy Practice and Quality at ASHP. Dr. Cory Gaconnet, Chief Anesthesiologist at the U.S. Naval Hospital in beautiful San Diego. And Peter Sturtevant, Senior Director, Community Engagement Pharmaceuticals at GS1. So let me begin with Stephanie and have her introduce herself and talk a little bit about her perspective on this issue. Stephanie?
Thanks, William. Thank you for having me. My name is Stephanie Field. I am the Director of Pharmacy at Spectrum Health West Michigan. Like we said, responsible for business services. In my purview includes 340B, pharmacy supply chain, pharmacy compliance, revenue cycle, business development, and technology and interoperability. From my perspective, I've been in pharmacy about 10 years, in supply chain in some capacity, in different leadership positions, and making the case for change has been an ongoing journey for pharmacy when it comes to both shortages, changes in regulations, challenges in the 340B program and access to medications, the resurgence or the surgence of specialty pharmacy medications, and some of the distribution challenges in that space, which has a profound impact on patients and providers, and really understanding how we can, from my perspective, leverage technology and some decision support in a cost-effective but efficient way to really support providers and pharmacists and nurses in doing the right thing for the patient, and really in a very complicated market, which is pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical supply chain. The costs are staggering, and I think the normal American feels that on an everyday basis, and understanding how to navigate that is pretty difficult. And so really understanding how we can have a paradigm shift in how we handle medication supply management and access from the beginning, from a hospital stay all the way to anything happening in the home.
Great, thanks very much. Let me move to Michael Ganio.
Yes, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here. And when I think of the question that you posed, the answer would be very different had this conference happened as scheduled back in March. When we received the invitation in January, the world looked different. I still would have said that the drug supply chain, particularly drug shortages, are a threat. They're, as we've already heard this morning, they can lead to medication safety errors. We also continue to hear about drug compounding errors. So the supply chain within the hospital, preparation, dispensing, administration, they're all important. So fortunately, you got the right person at ASHP either way. As Senior Director of Pharmacy Practice and Quality, my role is to provide resources and information and advocacy on both drug shortages, and I interface with ISNP, with USP, who develops compounding standards, with the FDA, who also has some compounding oversight. So all of the information that we're talking about today is within my areas of responsibility within ASHP. If you're not familiar, we are a professional medical organization. We have about 55,000 members who act as patient care providers in health systems and ambulatory care settings. And our umbrella is growing. One of the things that we talked about this morning, as Christopher Jerry talked through the medication error that's happened. That was unfortunate, but it was a technician error. It was a pharmacist overseeing that error. So we continue to try to find ways to outreach technicians who unfortunately aren't really a recognized career path. And so we have a lot of turnover, which is also a risk for that, for those preparation errors. since COVID, I think the supply chain threats have changed. You know, we think traditionally of the drug shortages, Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. We kind of held our breath during Hurricane Florence in 2018. There's some manufacturing that happens in North Carolina, but COVID really shifted our perspective. So we have a lot of reasons to change, both getting the drug to the hospital and then getting the correct drug prepared the correct way to the patient.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's move to Dr. Gaconnet.
Good morning. Sorry, good afternoon. It's morning in sunny San Diego. Thank you for having me. My name is Cory Gaconnet. I'm an active duty Navy pediatric anesthesiologist. I would ultimately say that I represent the tip of the spear, if you will, in this process. And I just appreciate everyone's efforts to try and help me take care of my patients. But as a practicing pediatric anesthesiologist and anesthesiologist, I represent in this whole process for this whole team that's on this meeting and conference today. I represent that last connection between system and patient. So I take that, it's a great bit of responsibility, and I'm honored to be able to represent everyone and be that final part of the final piece of that system. And so I do care for a myriad of patients, big and small, and for the Navy, and then also in the community as well. And my involvement in the reason that taking the time away from patient care for this meeting is I'm also a huge advocate for improving workflow in the operating room. And so what that means is that as a clinician, I've seen over the years, I've seen more and more burdens be placed and distractions be placed on clinicians, and often, ironically, with the goal of improving patient safety. And ironically, what that's occurred is actually it's a distraction from actually taking care of the patient. And I've seen this in not just in medication supply management, but also in monitoring and electronic charting, and just a whole host of things that are been added with the idea of progress and innovation, and they've actually resulted in more distraction. And I'll take this moment, if I may, just so everyone can really understand. And I appreciate all the non-clinicians as well. And I'm also very fascinated by the cost of business and doing business in medicine. But I want to give you this snapshot of what it really means to when I say that there's distractions in the operating room. And so imagine that you're driving, and you're driving at night. You're driving in the rain, and you're driving with a car full with some kids in the back. Screaming kids. Those are the surgeons, by the way, the screaming kids in the back. And so, and then you're trying to concentrate, but then someone's trying to talk to you, or you're trying to figure out the radio station. Or better yet, someone wants you to count all the green M&Ms in the snack bag. That's my analogy for medication management in the operating room. But all the while, you're still trying to drive and keep your family safe on the road, doing the best you can to maintain that concentration. That's what it's like to be in the operating room. And I think we can all relate to that. And so when you're thinking through all the different ideas and the ways that we can improve and innovate, improve patient safety, think of me, think of driving in that car. And that's as simple as it possibly can be. I cannot tell you the amount of inputs that I must process simultaneously for hours on end and maintain that vigilance, just like you would if you were driving your family across the country, or to go to see national parks in the rain at night, tired, and with all of these distractions, how you maintain that focus. That's what we're really talking about. And better yet, making sure that I have all the tools available to me that I need to treat my patients. And when you want to know what it really feels like, the medication supply and the medication shortages, I've had to adopt, and several of my colleagues agree with us, we feel very strongly about this, I've had to make moral compromises in the care of my patients because I did not have the appropriate tools, medications, IV fluids that I needed to take the best care of my patients. And I will tell you, if you don't think that a little bit of you as a clinician and as a physician taking the Hippocratic Oath, that a little me dies every time that I have to make that compromise, because the one medication that I know would be best for my patient that I have right in front of me is not available because of a supply chain issue or a shortage issue, it hurts. It hurts. And it's something that when you talk about burnout, it's these little things that add up throughout the day. And so not to be too down, I just want everyone to really know what it feels like to be the clinician on the end of this. And I also want to tell you how grateful and how much I appreciate everything that you're doing to try to make this better. It really means a lot, not just to the patients, but it means a lot to people like me that get up every day and go in and try and do the best job they can. So I know it may seem spreadsheets and analytics and deciding which RFID tags, that sort of thing, it may seem not disconnected, but I will tell you, it really does matter. And I just want to thank everyone on this call and on this conference for just trying to move this forward so that we can take better care of our patients. And these are our families, our loved ones, our sons and daughters, our moms, dads, brothers and sisters. And we've never seen it like this before in this country because of COVID, but I think we all feel it a little bit now. And so I just want to thank, and I'll end with that, and just want to thank you all for all of your work. And anything that we can do, even a little bit of change in the positive direction, does make a huge difference to all of us. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you. Yes, it's a very poignant time. The supply chain issues have really from COVID, have really brought this issue into full relief for all of us. Finally, we have Peter Sturtevant. Peter, please introduce yourself. Share your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Bill. And again, I look forward to this session this afternoon. And Cory, it's very interesting in terms of your perspective as it relates to your analogy, as it relates to what goes on in the operating theater. Thank you for that. But again, my name is Peter Sturtevant. I am Senior Director of Community Engagement with GS1 US, and I'm responsible for our pharmaceutical members in supporting them in preparation for the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. I've been in global supply chain for close to 40 years. Experience both in healthcare manufacturing, global transportation, logistics, and most recently with GS1 US for the past 6 years, again, supporting the pharmaceutical industry predominantly. GS1's a little bit unique in terms of our systems of standards. We create, hopefully, a foundation for business to be able to share those uniquely identify your products and your locations, then be able to actually capture that information. I've heard discussions already this morning about barcodes and RFID. Those are both GS1 standards. And then the ability to automatically share that information across the trading partners. GS1, again, is unique in that we are a global international standards body. We are neutral and nonprofit. We're governed by our members. We are a member-driven organization for adopting our standards, these GS1 standards that are built around the globe, but focusing here in the US in meeting those requirements. There are over 110 different member organizations or MOs of GS1, and I'm supporting GS1 US. All of our standards are developed globally, and we build solutions in applying those within the individual local markets. We serve over 300,000 businesses here in the United States. And we have 4 leading industry verticals in terms of apparel and general merchandise, food service, retail grocery, and I have responsibility for healthcare. We mentioned earlier as it relates to the different services and tools that we provide, whether it's a linear barcode, a GS128, the requirements for DSCSA as a 2-dimensional barcode, which is called a GS1 data matrix, or as we're hearing more and seeing more as RFID is being introduced into the supply chain. And I look forward to our discussions this afternoon. Thank you, Bill.
Certainly, Peter, thank you for your insights. I would encourage people in the on the call today to submit their questions. You have access to the Q&A area. I'm going to pull up a couple of those now, which look pretty interesting. My first question to the group is from an anonymous attendee saying, great opening thoughts, Dr. Gaconnet, and all appreciate all the speakers helping highlight change begins by opening up new cross supply chain conversations. So it looks like people are sharing your passion for this particular issue. Another question asks, why are we not designing drug pumps with NIR sensors to identify the compounds being delivered? So I guess I would open that up to anybody, maybe Dr. Gaconnet or others would be willing to talk about that.
No, I can address the and appreciate the support. The NIR sensor, it's a fascinating idea. I think at least what I've seen so far as far as commercial products being available, certainly there's the DEA and they're pretty good with their, and just for everyone, so it's using, if I understand correctly, it's using near infrared spectroscopy. So it's a chemical analytic where you can rapidly detect if, and the DEA uses it to rapidly identify if something's narcotics or not. And they have handheld scanners, which suggests that you would think that we would have that readily available in the operating room. But I haven't seen any commercial products come along far enough to be able to do that. But personally, as a clinician, as long as it doesn't require additional, like I said, that distraction in the operating room, I love the idea of having someone double check my work, because what a great feeling it is to not have to have that uncertainty. Is like, oh, and to the point where I have rules in my practice where if I never pull a medication into a syringe that's not already labeled. The reason for that is because guess what? You pull into an empty syringe, it's a clear liquid of a medication, and someone turns and you ask a question, and then you come back and you're like, what was that again? And well, I'll tell you, in my practice, that immediately goes into the medication waste bin. However, that's a real problem if it's a controlled substance. So now I have to account for that. So you can see how vulnerable we are in the operating room. So, but I would love the idea of that, because I could put it on a pump and I could make sure that that was actually the concentration that I intended. It was diluted correctly, because I have to trust, just even yesterday in the operating room, I have to trust the dilution for a syringe that I made for an infusion, that I also programmed the pump correctly, but that I also diluted the medication correctly as well. So I think that's a wonderful direction to go into. I will say that the commercially available spectroscopy products, the way they are currently on the market, do somewhat inhibit and have some limitations for actually identifying, and it's not necessarily identifying the medications. They do very well at that, and the concentration. It's actually identifying the dose, and meaning a volume versus concentration relationship, where basically the idea is if you say that this syringe has 1 cc in it and it's 50 mics of fentanyl, you want to be able to squirt it into the spectroscopy, into the spectrometer, and then show that it actually is 50 mics of fentanyl. So that's where I understand that we're at, but I do really like the idea of having that double verification and authentication in the operating room. It just needs to be practical enough not to impede workflow.
Yeah, because I could see where that would add complexity to the system. Let me throw out this question to anyone who would like to answer. How good is the visibility of the current medication supply chain for hospital clinicians? How transparent is the system so that anybody can kind of see what's going on? Is transparency something any of you talk about in the course of the whole supply chain issue? I'll just throw that out to anybody.
I can take a crack at that from a Spectrum perspective. We've looked at that for the last couple of years. We actually worked with Michigan State and one of their teams in a project to try to bring a interactive dashboard that compiled a number of inputs specific to our supply chain and the FDA and others to give some transparency. Think back to the doctor's point, some of that becomes noise and distraction. Some of these shortages can be maintained at a pharmacy level and they never get to the point of impact to a provider or a nurse, or we're watching it and we will never actually have an impact to our organization at all. So it's a fine line between giving them the most vital information that impacts them at the bedside or in a prescribing perspective, and then also just a monitoring. At Spectrum, we use a number of tools within our EHR to give them notifications. We have an algorithm that's supported through our physician builders. So they're the informaticists in the EHR space, provider from different specialties that understand what the impact is to their, because as an anesthesiologist, we'll have a different point of view than an oncologist would, or a PCP in relation to the work they do in their workflows and medication use in the EHR. And they give us some feedback on how we could best communicate or mitigate communicating shortages and handle it in a way that is unimpactful to their day-to-day. And so it's a varying degree of transparency depending on the severity of both the shortage and the impact of the medication to that provider.
Excellent. Others on transparency issues?
Yeah, I can build on that a little bit. And I think it's important what Stephanie mentioned is a lot of these shortages can be managed in the pharmacy department. And hearing the experiences from Cory are important. I think anesthesiologists, basically any clinician, any physician, nurse practitioner, whomever, who is actually handling medication can probably talk about drug shortage issues. Otherwise, pharmacy has been managing shortages for 20 years plus. So we'll find a way to get either the right medication. It may be a different dosage form. It may require a nurse to stand and push a medication through a syringe instead of hanging up a bag. But our anesthesiologists have experienced severe shortages in controlled substances and opioids specifically, in some of our pressors that we use to maintain patient vitals during operating room procedures. Emergency room physicians have had these same issues. Any physician who manages parenteral nutrition, there are about 40 different ingredients that can go in to help maintain patients' nutrition status if they can't take any food. Basically, every one of those components has been in some sort of shortage in the last 10 years. Oncologists have had to manage some regimens that are potentially curative in pediatric cancers especially. But otherwise, the average practicing clinician is probably writing for an order, having the pharmacy wade through these shortages. And at any given time in the United States right now, there's about 200 to 250 shortages to make sure the patient gets the most optimal treatment. Within the health system, or whatever the care setting is, it then becomes a communication issue. So that insight into what is on hand that day and what is the substitution that the hospital's Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee has decided on, that communication then becomes a really critical piece. So it may not be knowledge as to what's actually on the shelf or what's, whether it's a pharmacy bulk package, a 10-gram vial of vancomycin, or if it's pre-mixed 1-gram bags of vancomycin, that part may not be as important as what is our, opioid du jour for this week, because we don't have enough hydromorphone. We're asking everyone to use morphine. So that communication becomes super critical.
Peter, what's your thought on transparency, particularly the DSCSA implication associated with, because I think the spirit there is transparency, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously what we've heard from Cory and Stephanie and Michael is obviously they're living the front lines. But really, look, what DSCSA is looking to do is focusing on interoperability between the various trading partners, from manufacturer through wholesale distribution, ultimately to the dispenser and the pharmacist. The expectation is by 2023 that if there were a recall at the serialized level, that anyone within that supply chain would be able to identify that product and have it available and communicated back to industry within 24 hours. So that's the goal, that's the objective. By 2023, this interoperability, regardless of operating system, computer system that we're engaged with, that there is that visibility where the product is within the supply chain. I think it's also important to point out, it's really when there's a chain of ownership. Unfortunately, within DSCSA, the patient itself is not actually in scope. It's when it's being purchased by that last healthcare provider, and then how it has to be managed within their own internal systems that some of my colleagues have shared already this morning.
Sure. Yeah, interesting problem. I have a question here for Dr. Gaconnet. How does RFID lead to improved workflow in the OR?
That's a great question. It's interesting. So there's a couple of things I'll start with. I will say that that drug shortages or medication shortages are 100% transparent to me, because when I open the drawer, they're not there. so there's no confusion. But what I will say is that actually, when we had the large medication shortage, it taught me something that when we were running, I realized that there wasn't a lot of visibility on what medications we actually had in the operating room. And my less educated self immediately thought pharmacy. And then I realized, as I thought through it more, it actually wasn't the pharmacy's fault. It was our fault. It was the clinician's fault. And the reason is because the inventory control solution that we use, I use the term solution, the inventory control system that rhymes with Pixis, demands that I actually, and my colleagues actually inventory all of our medications when we increment, decrement all day long. And we weren't doing that. So the pharmacy had no way of visually or knowing, having the data to know what we had and what we didn't have. But it wasn't until then, the opioid shortages, that we really realized how critical of a disconnect there was between that, what we thought we had and what we knew we had. And we realized that we were part of the problem. Unfortunately, with that human factor involved in this supply chain, it's never going to be correct. It's never going to be right. And that's where RFID comes in, is you need to engineer and use technological advances and innovations to remove as many human factors out of the supply chain and also to the medication administration. That's the way that we can make this as safe as possible. It will never hit 100%, but we can get as close as we can by using technologies, for instance, RFID. And the reason I advocate for RFID is because, at least at this point, up to a certain part of the supply chain phase, that is actually seamless and passive, and it's not requiring that human interaction of being a stock person. Now, I'm not a huge advocate of a barcoding, because I feel like that makes me, the Pixis makes me a stalker at Target, and the barcode makes me the checkout person too.
Right.
So now I've got to
Exactly.
scan everything. And I really, as a clinician, that really impedes my workflow, is a nice way to say it. But to speak to what Peter was saying about GS1 and just following through that, I've really looked at this a lot and have thought through this a lot, is that I feel like there are 4 phases of this supply chain and the transparency and the shortages. And I also think that I love that Peter, he's so nice about it. He says that by 2023, it's recommended. I think that might have something to do with I believe it's the Drug Quality and Security Act of 2023. I may have something to do with that, but I really like the idea of knowing that when a medication leaves the manufacturer, that along that entire chain, that someone knows exactly where it is. So we can avoid counterfeiting, we can avoid recalls, we can avoid contamination, contaminants, all of those things, because I feel like other aspects of industry have already achieved that. I feel like Amazon has a pretty good idea where all their stuff is at all times. And I would love that for the medical field, and specifically we can start with pharmaceuticals. But if you look at that as in a 4-phase process, you have the manufacturer who now sends the medication and transfers the medication responsibility to the hospital. So that's going to be the gaining authority, is going to be the pharmacy. At that point, the pharmacy has a responsibility of dispensing that medication to clinical care areas. And then that last phase is going to be providers like myself, nurses, anesthesiologists, people that directly interact with medications, is to dispense that to the patient. And so I feel like focusing in this conference is really focusing on that, what I would consider the first and second phases. Know where the medication is at all times, get it safely to the hospital pharmacies. And then once the pharmacies have it, give them the tools to safely deliver that to the clinical care areas. And I will say there's a lot of work to be done from that last. So once it gets into my operating room and I know that I have the shortages are avoided, I have the transparency, I know exactly what I have, the pharmacy knows exactly what I have in that operating room, but that now there's still a lot of work to be done. How do we document that in the record? How do I make sure, how do I double check that I'm giving the correct medication dose, route of administration, and how do I have verification of that in the operating room? And that's where I'm still stuck, because there's a lot of challenges there. And I think RFID has a lot of solutions to get us to that last phase, knowing what we have and having that workflow there where I'm not the storekeeper any longer. But I still think there's a lot of work to be done to make that last leap. And that's what I'm excited about, is figuring that out in the operating room.
Yeah, that's really is a nice segue to our next question. And I don't know if any of you have had any experience with this, but one of the attendees asked, has any hospital put RFID readers at the entrances of operating rooms or patient rooms to record what medicine enters the rooms and sound an alarm if any medicine enters that is in error. Kind of an interesting question. Does anybody do that, or do you see potential for that sort of thing? Anybody? Stephanie?
It's interesting listening to Cory, because the standardization between hospitals is almost non-existent, because we don't have anesthesiologists do any sort of, we also use something that rhymes with Pixis, but we don't have them do any sort of inventory of the QBs. We have matrix drawers. I mean, there's just opportunities for so much differentiation in process and implementation of process across hospitals. I think that's an interesting concept. Again, it kind of goes back to Cory's point about the last step, right? So at Spectrum, we use Epic, and the way the anesthesiologists do their ordering is not off a pref card. They order their medications through what we call a macro and a one-step med. And so understanding what's a wrong medication would happen after it's been in the room. So thinking through how that would work in an everyday surgical interaction is interesting, because it may be once it's closer to the patient, right? Once they've actually ordered the medication and are ready to administer it. And is that too late? So it's definitely an interesting concept, but I do think, and I think this goes back to industry having a little bit of a hard time understanding where interoperability should or shouldn't happen, is the way hospitals implement technology and way they implement medication use cycles and distribution varies so significantly that understanding what the best options are can be difficult sometimes.
Yeah, and managing all the data associated with that, and what happens if there's some kind of inconsistency, and who gets that notification. And there are any number of challenges implementing technology into a system, and everybody has to be trained on the system, and there's just a variety of issues. My next question is from an attendee who asks, if barcode is replaced by RFID to address broader process visibility and address the need for more real-time data, what is the next breakthrough for technology to address? Are we confident that RFID is addressing product provenance and quality, or does RFID only prove that the label/container itself is trusted? How do we marry the trusted physical plus the digital identity of a medication? So what's your thought about that particular issue? I guess the question is RFID enough? And maybe some of you are saying not really. Any thoughts?
I'll just say real quick that it has that transition is really a vulnerability, and then I don't think we're quite there yet with RFID, how we take that vial that's been delivered to the operating room safely and been monitored, and the accountability has been there all the way up until it gets into the anesthesia card. Then how does someone like me, how do we take that technology and leverage it to accomplish those patient safety goals? So that's where when I say that I feel like there's a lot to be done here, and a lot of challenges that we all face in different ways, that I feel like focusing on the supply chain initially, getting the right medication, the unexpired, the non-recalled, the the right medication and the non-counterfeit medication delivered to the hospital, and we know where it is. That's a great first step. Because I think there's a lot of, and if we can accomplish that and manage the shortages better, because we have a better idea of our supply chain, and then know what is actually in our inventory, we can do cost control, and all of those things I think can be accomplished through really just focusing on the supply chain and then helping the pharmacies deliver those medications to the clinical sites. However, the next phase should be focusing, and doesn't mean they have to be can't be simultaneously, but they're right. I feel like taking that technology, and you're exactly right, and I've thought a lot about this, is how do we do this? And I feel like, going to pre-filled syringes, there's a lot of ideas with RFID tags on them. So that's what's actually shipped from the manufacturer. so that now I can use an RFID reader to, and then chart that into my record. So you never have a human printing out a label, typing in the concentration and putting that barcode on and then scanning that. That's a vulnerability right there, because what if I pick the wrong concentration? It could happen anytime. So once it leaves the manufacturer, I think that, and that is the challenge, is that we have those syringes. Plus, you know, we all know, the pharmacy knows that, I mean, I'm drawing up medications, and it's not nearly as good as what they do in the pharmacy when I drop medications into syringes. I mean, I've seen everything happen. I mean, I don't want to tell horror stories. People drop things. So you drop a syringe on the floor. Well, is it okay just to wipe alcohol swab off the tip and then use it? I don't know. I want to say no. In my practice, it's no, but I've seen people do that plenty of times. So I'm just saying that that if we can use RFID, incorporate it into initially, and then find a system where it can go directly to the patient without ever having to be withdrawn, modified, a sticker placed on it, or changed, and we still have the technology along the way to monitor and make sure that that exact medication was exactly what the manufacturer intended for that patient to receive. That's the ultimate goal, but we do have some work to get there.
Michael, did you have a comment?
I did, thanks. And I think, you know, no one technology has to be the solution. We can find the technology that fits for the right scenario. And you know, RFID is a really elegant solution, particularly in anesthesia carts or stocking kits, trays, but let's not lose sight of the fact that there's still a human factor there. Just as Cory was mentioning, you know, there's a human step of applying an RFID. You know, I think Fresenius Kabi is a manufacturer just recently who announced that several of their products will start shipping with RFID incorporated, but otherwise you still have a human there who has to apply the RFID within the health system or in the pharmacy to make sure that the technology is useful. So there's still that error-prone or potential step that's involved. The other thing is as far as replacing barcode, the one thing that's really nice about a barcode is I can print it from any printer. So, you know, the example of in the OR printing up a label to put on a syringe, all you need is a printer and a scanner. So there are applications for the different technologies. The same thing with the NIR spectroscopy. Within a pharmacy, it can be used to check for the contents of a syringe to make sure if it's an opioid or if it's fentanyl or morphine, whichever opioid. But also if you're doing batching of products, there was actually a product that made it to market. I don't think there's been a lot of uptake of it. But let's use the right technology to fit the right setting and what we're doing for each one of those steps.
And Michael, you mentioned Fresenius Kabi, and you're absolutely right. They are taking that approach. Now they're continuing to use the two-dimensional barcode, the GS1 data matrix, on the packages, which is the lowest saleable unit, but they will be using the RFID tags on the unit of use, so the dose level. You know, we've seen RFID, it's in infancy stages right now within healthcare, but it's certainly been very successful in other industries. Probably most noted is apparel. And probably isn't nearly as critical in apparel as it is in healthcare. But we've seen aerospace, and we've even seen things as with baggage tracking as it relates to a lot of the major airlines are using RFID tags with those tags that are on when you submit your baggage to the airline. And obviously, we know some of the frustrations we have with that. With lost bags, and so it's really improved that where you don't have to have the line of sight for scanning the barcode. Yeah,
and the complexities within healthcare, I think, you know, Christopher Jerry this morning brought up the point about the phone assembly, and you know that's repeating the same step millions of times. Healthcare doesn't function that way, so I agree. I think there's a lot of potential growth for technologies, and how do we take an extremely complex system and find ways to make these technologies helpful? And Cory had mentioned the unit of use packaging would be perfect. You know, everything coming from the manufacturer, there's no manipulation, reduces any kind of error. We're working on a campaign to try to standardize concentrations of drugs so that there's less variability in preparation, and hopefully some of it can come from a manufacturer pre-prepared. But the reality is that there's still going to be you know, pediatric patients or weight-based drugs in the oncology setting, whatever it might be, that there's going to be some variability, and so we need to be able to incorporate all those complex steps into whatever technology solutions we employ.
Speaking of that complexity, an attendee asked a really interesting question. Can we ever develop that quote unquote Amazon visibility with so many different participants in the supply chain operating so many different IT systems? Amazon had the luxury of designing their business around the technology, but hospitals have to retrofit their technology to fit the business. And so in Spectrum, for example, as you guys acquire hospitals in your system and you try and build the system, I suspect IT compatibility is an enormous challenge under that kind of acquisition issue.
Yeah, integration of new sites and new technologies and technical debt that goes along with that is a significant concern. We got mostly on a single instance of Epic a couple years ago, but it still creates technical issues and concerns in that capacity. There are some, I think Epic's usually a little behind the times, right? They're trying to do a little bit of everything instead of a couple things really great, but they do have some solutions that give you that transparency within the hospital four walls on where the medication is. It requires barcoding. It's not to the point of RFID, although that is on their roadmap. But yes, absolutely different specialty EHRs. We have a special EHR for our Aeromed helicopter transport. That doesn't necessarily integrate into Epic beautifully, and other things in our NICU with transport and things like that. So yeah, it's an interoperability is a buzzword, but it's a real challenge for providers, for medication use, for really the entirety of the healthcare system. So
yeah, very, very interesting challenge. One attendee commented, I added RFID sensor to a lab handling 2,000 samples a day. We could tell with a single click where each sample was located with no human interaction. So maybe to your point that under some circumstances, there are very specific kinds of applications where trying to maximize transparency and efficiency through RFID can have some value. But another respondent, attendee rather, made this comment, which is interesting now, and I'd like your reaction to this. Now isn't the time to push for RFID in most health systems. We can all agree that patient safety is paramount. Patient safety officers need to change their messaging from don't you care about patient safety to patient safety at what cost? Our local area has had hospital closures in the past 18 months. COVID has forced many health systems to furlough or lay off staff. Our health system suffered a loss of several $100 million in this fiscal year. The best way to promote patient safety is to make sure that the hospital's doors stay open. I'd like your thoughts on that. It's kind of, is the timing right for these kinds of technological advances? Can we afford not to, or how do we balance these conflicting forces?
I just want to address that just briefly. That's an interesting comment, and I completely appreciate that. A lot of my colleagues were no longer employed in a field, frankly, that I think all of us thought we would always have jobs and positions, and I am sorry for those healthcare closures because that does limit resources and healthcare access to that whole region. And I agree, it's a tough time to be looking at capital purchases, but I also want to say a couple of things. Is that that COVID will end. There is a light at some point. I'm not sure when that'll be, and we do have to maintain our forward thinking and moving forward, and not become stagnant because of the adversity and challenges we face. However, speaking more to the point of the question, is that what I feel is this is an opportunity. When we are running in such the red on these healthcare systems, that this is an opportunity to reevaluate how we do business in healthcare, to really look at, okay, how much waste are we really following through, and how much, and it's unbelievable. Like, we have to get smart about this, like other industries. And I'm not saying ever compromise patient care. I'm not suggesting that, because I certainly wouldn't want to ever be in that position as a physician. However, I'm saying that we're not doing it well. And I work for the government, and I know we don't do it well. And it's tough. I'm not saying that it's easy, and there's a lot of, but by knowing and basically having a better control of your pharmaceutical costs at that healthcare system, that's a huge, and the same for DoD health. It's a huge expense, actually more than anything. And I don't know what, and I would defer to my pharmacy colleagues about how much of percentage of the operating budget of each healthcare system is connected to pharmaceutical costs. However, if you think about this as like, this is an opportunity to reevaluate how we approach managing our pharmaceutical inventory, and we have this opportunity to better control that and to streamline it, and to also actively manage it, not just hope that we don't run out of something, but actually actively manage it. Because I see it, the prices of things change almost weekly or daily, the prices of some of these medications. And so by actively managing your inventory and having that data and that visibility and that knowledge, you can decide, hey, wait, neostigmine is a tenth of the price that it was last week. Okay, let's go ahead and stock up on neostigmine. How much do we need? But that's an entire mindset change of how we're doing business in healthcare. And I just think that, but part of it is going to be knowing what we have and being able to actively manage that. That's the first step. But I also appreciate that it's a capital cost, and, do you have to make those choices? But I just want to know there's also an opportunity seen in this, horrible state of affairs that we've experienced in the last few months.
Others commenting on that, Stephanie?
Yeah, I would say I completely agree. I think nothing can be looked at through a singular lens. There's really smart places to invest, and I think every organization has to decide if RFID is the right thing to do for them. But there's other things that we need to look at, maybe stop doing or doing differently. In the morning session, someone mentioned common canister. I've been in pharmacy at Spectrum Health 10 years. It's come up more times than I can count, and COVID really accelerated that. EICU, COVID accelerated that for our regional hospitals, and that was, a technology barrier that got accelerated, and is this cost savings for the organization, but also for the patients, and it's a patient satisfier. So I think, it is hard. I know Fairview just announced some closures yesterday, which was hitting some of our close colleagues pretty hard. It will continue to be a rough couple of years, I would imagine, but I don't think that is at the risk of not moving forward and progressing and doing the right thing. It just is a more critical eye on what we should be doing, and prioritization of the work and what things need to stop happening.
Great points. Michael, did you want to comment?
Yeah, again, I'll refer back to Christopher Jerry's presentation this morning, and we didn't really talk about the cost of medication errors. Certainly the impact to patients and patient outcomes, but medication errors aren't an insignificant cost to the healthcare system. So increased monitoring, increased lab tests, increased diagnostic tests that might be needed. So if there's ways to improve the accountability on the operations of the medications and reduce waste, that's great. But there's also these soft dollars that can be realized if we have safer systems. So while the ROI may not necessarily incorporate those dollars, it's important to keep the fact that medication errors, and I don't remember this, that somewhere around $2,000 per error that occurs on average or something like that. So, there's some other savings that can be realized.
Sure. Another interesting question that has popped up for us to consider. It says, other than traceability and counterfeit detection, can that be provided by RFID? Do we see any need for the environmental condition monitoring of the drugs? For example, temperature controlling or light sensitivity controlling. Do you see a need for adding that kind of additional information other than just, is this the right drug or not? The actual condition of the drug. Is that something that is on anybody's radar screen?
Well, I don't know about the capability of RFID for this, but Certainly cold chain is going to be a huge issue coming up with COVID vaccines. There's one vaccine right now that's being studied that requires ultra cold storage in minus 70-degree freezers. I've worked in investigational drugs in my career, and a lot of the drugs that are sent from study sponsors come with a product that'll tell you if it's maintained the correct temperature throughout the storage and shipment. If that's something that's available on the actual unit of use product, I think that's extremely helpful to know, there's a quality and safety check involved, not just to make sure it's the right product, but also that it's been stored correctly and the potency is reasonably assured.
I know there are technologies we're working on here at Michigan State to actually sense temperature and other factors associated with the quality of
That would
medications.
be great. I just, if there was a way to a technology, I'm not sure if RFID would be able to, other than building that into the location monitoring of the actual medication, so you knew the environment that it was in, so you could tie that into other sensors to know. But if there was a way from the industry to monitor those unit packaging, I'm just speaking from experience being in 115 degrees in Afghanistan as an active duty anesthesiologist. I was pulling meds out of a container, a shipping container that probably was close to 130 degrees, could only go in for maybe 5 or 10 minutes to get meds before you had to come out because of risk of dehydration. So I used those meds because that was only what was available to me. I mean, I was practicing out of a tent in the desert in Afghanistan. So you use what you have, but I would have been great to know if I shouldn't have been using those or they were ineffective medications. So I fully support any type of progress that we can make in that realm, not just for battlefield use, but also for, of course, with the different environmental catastrophes and unfortunately challenges we face in this country, and then the different areas. Would be great to know if your medication is ineffective. And the reason I say that is even in the more germane hospital environment, we often have things in anesthesia where, say, a woman comes in for a cesarean delivery, and we typically do a spinal anesthetic. Well, we've all had several spinals fail, and perfectly placed, of course, but we'll take that out of it. But no, very, very straightforward placement, and then we have the spinal not work, and we always wonder, well, is this a bad batch of bupivacaine? But it would be so wonderful to have to where it never got to clinical use, because the pharmacy saw that the indicators when that unit arrived and returned it to the manufacturer saying, hey, this was not effective. So
one attendee wants to know whether using RFID and similar technologies into instruments such as a syringe holder or a drip bag might lower barriers to consistent and convenient usage. He suggested consider engaging clinical shadowing courses to bring biomedical engineers in to observe practice and look for ways to reduce steps and improve usage. In other words, an interdisciplinary approach to this particular effort to try and gain the expertise needed to make these systems more efficient. Peter, have you ever heard of anybody sort of taking this interdisciplinary approach?
There's been some work done in that area, but not a lot. And so I probably some of my colleagues may have a better perspective on that than I do.
Anybody else do that sort of thing? Is bring in biomedical engineers or others to sort of assess kind of what's going on?
Well, I'll just speak to my experience that the company that I've been involved with that connected me with Axia is actually IntelliGuard, and I have to applaud them. From the very beginning, they brought me in as a clinician, and they designed their entire product around not the RFID technology. I'm not smart enough to understand that truly. However, when they wanted to put it into a clinical space, they brought in clinicians to provide all of the impact, and they redesigned their product. And that's why I have an utmost amount of respect for them, because they were smart about it, and they got the clinicians, the end user involved, and then they were willing to listen and make the changes that were necessary to not impede workflow and to make the product as best as it can with cost constraints and all of those things that go into a product in design.
Mm-hmm.
But they did make the effort and make those changes. And as a clinician, I wholly respect that. And just for
Sure.
you know, along that line with the question, it really, please involve clinicians. There are other clinicians out there like myself that will take time away from their patient care to provide input. I feel like it's my duty, my contribution back to my specialty in medicine, to take what I know clinically and share that with the biomedical engineers, share that with the engineers, the designers, and actually help them know what to do, how to make a product that's going to be, for me, that's going to work best for my patients and for me as a clinician. So I would highly encourage that in any way to bring in the clinicians. And I know it is challenging, but there are people out there who are willing to do it and contribute.
Here's a question for you, Peter. Do you anticipate more manufacturers will add GS1 technology for their medications going forward? Do you see this trend increasing?
Well, we've certainly seen as it relates to the requirement for a two-dimensional barcode, a GS1 data matrix, identifying 4 key elements, which is the global trade item number, where the pharmaceutical manufacturers embed their NDC into their G10, serial number, lot number, and expiration date. We're seeing within the manufacturing community that's we're in the high 90% compliance as it relates to that. So absolutely, we are definitely seeing that the use of that. And then, we talked earlier about interoperability and really between those trading partners. And we have a sharing technology called EPCIS. With EPCIS, it allows to identify all the major events that occurred with that pharmaceutical product from the time it was actually serialized, or call that commissioning, how it was packed and aggregated, and then shipped along the entire supply chain all the way to the dispenser. So that's where that interoperability, because your different manufacturers, your wholesale distributors, your healthcare providers are going to be operating off of different systems. So you need to have a method and a means in how you can share that information in an interoperable fashion.
Yeah, folks that we've worked with and actually have talked a lot about blockchain applications and trying to increase transparency through blockchain applications to have greater data accessibility from all of the different players in this particular issue. In fact, the next question relates to that. It said, related to the fragmented nature of status of supply chain currently, would any panelist agree that with serialization or RFID, that manufacturers would be in a logical place to keep a central status, a central data bank, I suspect, through the supply chain to show the central status of their product as the brand and quality owner? When it was dispensed, used, recalled, stolen, prevent a reuser number across any location regardless of channel. Is that a vision that you would love to see implemented, is to have this sort of ultimately transparent database so that everybody could kind of see what's happening? Michael, is that on your wish list for your birthday?
I'm trying to think through that, and there's definitely merits to that, but I also wonder about the patient privacy issues that could come up from something like that. If I know that we're affiliated with Michigan State, but I still live in Columbus. I worked for Ohio State Medical Center for about 18 years. And, I think if there was a way to notify the medical center that, this particular lot and these serial numbers within that lot were affected by some sort of recall or some sort of quality issue, and leave it up to the medical center to then take it from there, protects that patient information. And Cory, maybe you can weigh in, but I also think that hearing from the provider in many cases is the best way to go when discussing this sort of thing with a patient or with a caregiver. So having a global accountability for their own products, I think, would be good, in that sort of centralized database of where the product is, especially thinking through the beginning stages of COVID in New York City. They couldn't get the neuromuscular blockers and the sedatives for their ICU patients, if they had more insight into where their products were located around the country, or even some of the big distributors, more insight into where those products were and where they were being used in what volumes, certainly could have responded more quickly to shift supplies around. But as far as getting to the patient level, I guess personally I would have some reservations, but as with anything new that's breaking down barriers, it just has to address those issues before it's adopted.
Yeah, it's a really important issue. A couple of folks have talked about the issue here of trustworthy data, allowing the whole system to be optimized, looking at it as an investment to liberate operational efficiency, not as a pure expense. In other words, how do you leverage that into being able to monetize itself, sort of pay for itself over time? Another attendee commented that RFID has been proven to reduce cost, increase charge capture, and dramatically increase 340B reimbursement, especially in mixed use OR and surgical procedure areas. Existing RFID users are seeing total ROIs of less than 6 months on some of these technologies. Have any of you actually implemented RFID and sort of tracked the ROI on the implementation of the technology? Stephanie, have you guys done any of that?
Yeah, I mean, we have looked at RFID in the past in relation to the correlation for 340B capture, not necessarily. I think some of the processes we have in place make that capture rate increase less than maybe some other areas. We have some very specific workflows in the OR spaces where they're not barcode scanning to have better charge capture, and then which correlates to better accumulation on the 340B side as well. I mean, it's an interesting thought. I think that any accuracy in documentation increases your compliance with 340B. I mean, it absolutely, regardless of it being in the OR or a nurse administering and not scanning. So, capturing that and figuring out what your gap is sometimes can be difficult, especially based on the size of your organization. But yeah, it absolutely could be part of the equation and making RFID a financial win for the organization.
Yes, one of our attendees commented that we all know that implementing technologies is expensive. It costs money to do that. What do you think can cover the cost of implementing RFIDs into the pharmaceutical packaging? Who bears the cost? How do we sort of leverage the cost across whom, right? Who should bear the cost? Insurance companies, government, pharmaceutical companies, end users. Where's the burden of the cost stretched in this sense? Any of you have any thoughts about optimally, should it be shared? Is it one group or another? Where do you think the cost burden should lie?
I guess from my perspective, all of that is probably true, but ultimately the patient becomes responsible in whatever capacity that ends up being, right? If it's increased costs on an administrative level, if it's an increased cost of the individual medication. And so being mindful and a good steward of those patient resources is incredibly important.
Yes, it's an interesting problem. Anytime you have this new technology, it becomes kind of a challenge of just how do you recapture the costs and so forth. Obviously, there are some direct issues with 340B and so forth. But
I like to think of it also as a cost avoidance. Is better So a couple of things. As you look through it, I do worry that with the nature of our society and our country and our culture, where individuals in part of the healthcare system, meaning the pharmaceutical manufacturers, the healthcare systems, the hospitals, I do worry that at some point they're going to be held to a higher level of accountability if there is a medication error, if there is a contaminant, if there is a recall, if a medication was administered to a patient wrongly, and I mean litigation. So there's somewhat of a cost avoidance in that responsibility. I just feel in our culture that it's becoming more and more okay to go up and up the chain to hold those individuals accountable for a mistake that may have been completely disconnected. But I also will say that that's what we're looking at, is making sure that the manufacturers are accountable along the entire supply chain. So what we're really talking about as far as how to offset the cost is really a cost avoidance, a cost of how much product expirations, and not having good visibility and data on expiring medications. How, looking, and specifically, the succinylcholine choline and the expiring of it being refrigerated and being out of the refrigerator, managing that better, because we actually know where all the medications are, and it's not just a wasteful, oh, well, hey, this has been out for 2 weeks, let's throw it out. So I feel like the cost is significant and shouldn't be overlooked. However, I feel like it's easy to look at a cost when you look at at a spreadsheet and say, oh, this is what it's going to cost me to add our RFID technology to my practice. But what we don't see is the cost avoidance, and that's what Michael was kind of talking about, is the cost of medical errors, like that there is a cost associated with that extra care. And so it's just easier when you're developing a budget to have a cost that's been added to you versus what cost avoidance. But my answer to that was, well, that's the problem of not having good data. So once you have good data, and whatever technology you use, RFID, barcoding, that allows you to have that good data, to know what your waste is, to know what you're using, to know that you're not using cost-effective purchasing and adjustments, that's when you can actually start really seeing the answers and the solutions to that. So I think, yes, it's going to ultimately be borne on the healthcare system, but we need to get somewhere where we can actually make informed decisions about that cost.
If there is a med recall, how would barcode ensure the ability to find all the individual meds involved that need to be pulled across the large hospital? It seems this attendee, to this attendee, seems that RFID would be better for this, since its item level traceability would ensure that every recalled item has been identified and accounted for. So is recall a significant issue in medication in hospitals, Stephanie? Do recalls happen?
Yes, they absolutely happen. I think the impact to the organization I'll say a lot of medication recalls are retrospective, to the point where we generally don't have the medication anymore, right? So I can say in the last 10 years, we've probably had a couple where we needed to get to the point where we were pulling stock from the floors. Generally, we know where the majority of our medications are, right? Through either automated dispensing cabinets or carousels, et cetera. We have an inventory management system, so that helps with understanding where all of our meds are. RFID would be more efficient from that capacity, rather than running reports and looking for and sending out boots on the ground to pull back medications. Absolutely.
And I can actually, I'll welcome the opportunity to circle back to something that Peter mentioned. The DSCSA and the whole idea of serialization and lot numbers and barcodes is primarily meant for the supply chain to make sure it's secure, but there is a patient care component to it. And barcoding can actually, if the technology is within EHR, if that lot number has been recalled, there surely could be built into the medication administration component, or if you're using a barcode scan for preparation of medication, to recognize that that lot has been recalled, if the EHR has been programmed or whatever the workflow software is, or after the fact to know that a recalled medication has been administered to somebody. Because as Stephanie mentioned, you typically would get notice that a lot's been recalled. You can tell from your purchase history whether you've received some of that lot or not, but you really, once it's in your health system, you sort of lose track of that, unless it's a particular medication like a vaccine. There's some of the biologics, not like the oncology biologics, but like blood products. We don't typically track lot numbers. So having that built into the barcode would definitely help, make it easier to trace. Certainly RFID, as Stephanie mentioned, would be more efficient, but medications aren't stored that many different places. In the event of something that's in a dispensing cabinet on different floors, you know exactly which floors those are on, and which pockets and which drawers. So I think the key is getting that lot level identification either into the RFID or into the barcodes.
But Michael, isn't it even better at the serialized level than just the lot level? So you can, so that's really where we're going.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, Peter, let me ask you this. GS1 plays a significant role in track and trace millions of products across numerous industries. Are there lessons we can learn from others that are successful that we can bring to healthcare? I mean, just broadly speaking.
Yep. Well, if you look at one of the other verticals is the produce industry. And we've heard about some of the challenges, recalls of lettuce and other products in that regard. So there's been a great deal of work of focusing on the use of barcode technology right now, using a linear barcode, a GS1128, all the way from the field, all the way to the table. So there's, there is the product traceability initiative in utilization of GS1 standards has made a very significant improvement in the ability to track produce. So we are seeing it in other industries. And I would say clearly, if you look at healthcare, I would say that the pharmaceutical industry is further along than our colleagues in med device in a number of these areas. But yes, absolutely, through the use of barcode technology, the capabilities are there. So I think it's important, as we've heard today, it's not one size fits all. Right. And you need to build the applications based on the particular needs and the requirements of the various users.
Yes, it sounds like RFID is suitable in some circumstances, very localized technology issues we've explored. The transparency issues are important, being able to store and manage those data, dealing with privacy issues and so forth, very difficult. We have just a couple of minutes left. Anybody have any final thoughts about this particular issue or challenge that we're facing, sort of where we're headed in the future, and sort of what, from your perspective, is the most important mandate to pursue? Any of you wish to comment on that? Don't make me call on somebody. But I will. I'll call on Michael. What's your thoughts about that particular issue? I mean, is all this just a fantasy, or are we really headed down the right path here?
I think you hit on it, and I said the same thing earlier. Is that you find the technology that works for the situation you're working in, and in certain scenarios, one technology is going to be better than another. It's exciting to hear about some of these things. I learned a little bit today because I'm not. I know a fair amount of RFID in the application of packing anesthesia kits and trays and things like that. But seeing some of the comments and questions in here on what our RFID might be capable of in future applications is exciting. But at the same time, there are technologies that can be implemented today that are lower threshold, lower bar for entry, and I think healthcare, as we've established, has a long way to go. But we can piece together these different technologies and find the best way to keep our patients safe.
Yes, Michigan State is trying to, at the Axia Institute, is really trying to pursue the full range of these issues. So we're doing research now on being able to examine the qualitative features of packaging and other kinds of concerns, because we always take what we call a value chain approach, not a supply chain approach. A value chain approach is optimized for patients or end users or customers, rather than optimized for internal purposes. So we try to take that approach in the context of developing technologies that make the most sense for the organization in the pursuit of its goals, given the constraints of its resources. So we're always trying to deal with that. I want to thank everyone for attending today and really making the case strongly that there are options out there. There are ways in which we can manage the complexity of the supply chain for medications with the ultimate goal of achieving patient safety and trying to prevent what happened to Emily, Jerry, and hundreds of thousands of others in the course of this particular issue.